All right, let's begin. We're a couple minutes past the hour. My name is Lisa Osipenko, and I head Consilium Scientific. Today, we're welcoming Nick Woolley, who is the manager at Frontier Economics. And Nick participated in one of our sessions last year on prevention of cancer, and his points on the economics behind it were so interesting that we decided to invite Nick back to delve into the details and tell us about the societal and economic costs of preventable cancers in the UK. So, Nick is an economist who's working in health, and he asked me to make a distinction that he's not exactly a health economist, but we're looking for a fantastic talk. So, Nick, please go ahead.
Lisa, thank you very much. Yeah, really pleased to be joining you today and talking a little bit more about this. Yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. As Lisa said, I'm a manager at Frontier Economics. For anyone who's not come across Frontier, we're a consulting firm, employee-owned, based in London, and we work across almost all areas of public policy, but including health, which is a significant component of our work, and that's where I specialise. Within our work in health, we do quite a lot of different sorts of projects, different pieces of work. One sort of category of types of project we do is what we would call a cost of illness study or a burden of disease study. And that's what this is, looking in this case at preventable cancers. We've also done work on obesity, respiratory conditions, cardiovascular disease using similar approaches. And I should say the full report that I'm going to talk about today is available on Frontier's website. So anyone who wants to look at more details can do so there. I'll just present the key points and headlines today. I've got about a dozen slides, which I think will take me about 25 minutes or so, and then plenty of time for I hope, an interesting discussion and questions. So with that, let me dive in. And first, just by way of context, I think this will be familiar to most people, certainly anyone working in the health space. There are big challenges at the moment. So big challenges in terms of our growing and aging population, rise in long-term conditions and individuals having multiple conditions, increasing health inequalities, all of which, amongst other things, leads to growing demand on the health system. So that's what, as an economist, we would think of as demand side pressures. On the flip side of that, on the supply side, actually, there are also challenges. So the amount of money that's available to the healthcare system is tight at the moment. There are workforce shortages across the NHS and social care systems, and more generally, the link between the NHS and social care system is quite a key one, where pressures in one lead to consequences in the other. So maybe not surprising, given those pressures, that one of the questions that policymakers and new governments are asking themselves is, how can we prevent more diseases to reduce the burden and to make all our taxpayer pounds spent on healthcare go a little bit further? More specifically, the background to this particular bit of work, which was not a paid piece of work. This was not something we were hired to do by anyone in particular. This was just something that we at Frontier felt was an interesting and potentially important piece of work, and it was driven by some Cancer Research UK work from a few years ago, which shows that around 40% of cancer cases are preventable. And here, preventable means specifically attributable to a modifiable risk factor. So that would include smoking, it would include obesity, it would include exposure to UV radiation. And in 2023, which was the latest available data when we did this work initially, in 2023, there were 184,000 approximately cancer cases which were preventable. And that struck us as quite a significant number, and we set ourselves the exam question to understand what are the economic and societal costs associated with those 184,000 cancer cases in 2023, and looking forward, what are the costs associated with preventable cancer over the next 10, 15, 20 years. It was a relatively rapid piece of work, and therefore had to be a little bit targeted, and we weren't able to look at absolutely everything we wanted to. One important way in which we focused the work was to look at 4 particular cancers in more detail. So this will be repeated through the slides, where we look at lung, bowel, melanoma, and breast cancer. And the reason for picking those tumor types is it's a combination of, they're quite common cancers, so there's quite a lot of cases, but also relatively high proportions which are preventable. And the combination of those 2 things means that these 4 tumor types account for more than half of those 184,000 preventable cases between them. And to give you a sense of that, if you take breast cancer, for example, extremely common cancer, around 25% of cases are preventable. By contrast, melanoma, not so commonplace, but actually around 85% of those melanoma cases are preventable. Before we dive into numbers in this presentation, and before we dove into any number crunching when we did this piece of work, we started from an impact framework, and that's what's on the slide here, which underpins the rest of the analysis we've done. So we went and reviewed some of the literature that's already been done in this space. We thought carefully about it and captured what we think are the main impacts to the economy and to society from those cancer cases. As you can imagine, the data and evidence for these different elements, it's better in some areas than others, and that's another way in which we've been pragmatic in capturing costs where we were able to do so, and understanding those where we could do so, accepting that there are other areas where the evidence just isn't there or is weaker. And that maybe sort of brings me to another point which is worth mentioning up front, which is throughout the work we've done here, and more generally our approach to this sort of study, is to be conservative wherever we can. So in terms of the assumptions we make in the modelling, in terms of the evidence we rely upon, and in terms of the costs that are included ultimately in the analysis that we put together, we err on the side of caution. And as a result, the numbers that I'll present on the next few slides would typically, would in general, I think you could consider them as being conservative, and if anything, an underestimate of the total true costs. So let me get straight to those headline results. So first part of our exam question was looking at those 2023 cases, 184,000 or so, and our estimate is that those cases account for total societal and economic costs of 113 billion, which is a little over 5% of GDP. Just to be clear what those costs are and what they're not. So firstly, these are not all cash costs, and I'll come on to explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Secondly, they're also not all incurred, all of those costs, not all incurred in 2023. So these costs, again, as I'll explain a little bit more later, occur over around 8 years or so, we estimate. So the costs over that 8-year period of all those cancer cases that are newly diagnosed in 2023. But also, to be clear, this doesn't include the costs from those cases that will be diagnosed in 2024. So in 2024, you have another cohort of new cases being diagnosed, and these costs, or a similar quantum of these costs, would then also be associated with those cancer cases the following year. Just to explain the chart that you see here, the breakdown of these costs, you'll see there are two particularly large components. So firstly, the costs to individuals. So to explain what this is a combination of quality of life losses for individuals suffering from cancer and years of life lost amongst those who will die from that preventable cancer. So we're accounting for both mortality and morbidity in this figure, and this is a non-financial cost. So this is a cost to individuals in terms of that lost life and lost quality of life, which is absolutely consistent with cross-government approaches to value health gains and health losses. So this is straight out of the Green Book, as it's known, which is owned by Treasury, which some people may have come across as a standard best practice way of understanding impacts on individuals. So that's the largest component, which is around 65 billion. The next largest component on the right hand side is those economic costs. So this is lost economic output from individuals, again covering both morbidity and mortality. So it's individuals being taken out of the workforce as a result of premature death. It's also individuals having to take time out of work while receiving treatment, for example. And this covers both paid work and unpaid work. So this is including work that might be done domestically. It would include work that individuals might be volunteering, that they are taken out of as a result of cancer. Those are the two largest cost buckets. There's then three smaller ones across the middle. So you'll see health and social care, and these might look like they're relatively small costs, but that's only really in comparison. These are still billions of pounds of treatment and care costs to the health and social care system, and this is tens of thousands of pounds cost to the NHS per individual cancer case. The final category, family and carer costs. So this is the unpaid caring burden. So again, this is a non-financial cost. This is the opportunity cost to those individuals when someone has cancer. Often there is a burden on their family, friends, carers to provide care, which is not formal care, it's not paid care, but this is a way of capturing the cost, the value of that time which is being provided in unpaid care. So those are the components of our 113 billion pounds for 2023 preventable cancer cases. As I mentioned, there were two parts to the exam question that we set ourselves. The second part was, what might these costs look like in future years? So let me come on to that. So the key result here, we looked at costs of cases up to 2040. And our overall estimate was that the 3.7 approximately million new preventable cancer cases that will be diagnosed over that period in total will drive 1.88 trillion in costs. That's driven by increases in the number of those cases. So year on year, as I say, there will be a new cohort of cancer cases diagnosed, and that number is itself increasing. So if you look at the left-hand side chart here, those preventable cancer cases of 184,000 in 2023, and you can see the breakdown by the different tumor types here. That increases to over 220,000 based on the best forecasts we could find over the next 15 or so years. The second part then, and the right-hand side of the slide here, is the costs associated with that. So you start in 2023 with those costs that we talked about on the previous page of 113 billion, and over time you incur those costs for each new cohort. And if you're wondering why that goes down rather than going up, that's because these costs have been calculated in 2023 terms. So again, consistent with those approaches that I mentioned from the Green Book, standard cross-government appraisal of policy interventions will be done on this basis. We discount future costs or future benefits back to present value terms, and that's what we've done in this chart here. And we do that so that we can then add those costs up, and we add them up for each of those years out to 2040. And the sum of all of those costs is the 1.88 trillion that you see at the top of the slide. I'll give one quick slide, maybe after a mouthful of water, on a little bit more about how some of those costs have been put together. So the costs for individuals, I mentioned that these are costs not just incurred in a single year, but for up to 8 years after that diagnosis. And what we're doing there in the modelling is combining the data that we've got on the incidence of cancer, so the number of cases that we will see in that year. Secondly, the proportion of those which is preventable, so that's the 40% that I started with. And then also we're looking over time at the survival rates of those individuals. So if you look in the chart at the top of this slide, you'll see the profile of the number of cases that we expect for individuals that are driving all those costs that I described on the previous slides, which are driven in part by whether those individuals survive and treatment is successful and can get back to work and their quality of life will improve and so forth, or whether, sadly, those individuals will not survive. And so if you look at the lung cancer line here on the chart, so the number of cases in year 0, that's the base year for 2023 or 2024. Over time, the number of those cases declines as over the first 2-3 years, some of those cases, some of those individuals will die. And the steepness of that curve for lung cancer, which is a bit different from those other tumor types, reflects those low survival rates in the first couple of years for lung cancer, which are significantly, those survival rates are significantly lower than for other cancers where that curve is a bit flatter. The second thing that we're doing in those calculations, which is on the bottom half of the slide here, is understanding how those costs that I mentioned, how those develop over time as well. So you'll see here in year 0, you've got 100% of cost. That's our starting point in 2023 for that initial cohort. But then over time, as you can imagine, those initial high treatment costs within the NHS, for example, that care burden on families or carers, those costs decline in subsequent years as individuals hopefully get good treatment and get better. And the profile of those costs is what you see on the bottom of this slide. And you might notice here that melanoma as a tumor type is a bit of an outlier, and that's because the typical sort of profile of treatment of melanoma cases is that within 2 to 3 years, individuals will either be completely recovered or will sadly have died, and that the ongoing impact of melanoma is very low, if not zero, after that 2 to 3 year period. So combining those things in our modelling, that allows us to estimate on a case-by-case basis what would be those costs over the next 8 years for all new diagnoses in any given year. And then on top of that, as I described, we look at the new cohort of cases that will occur year on year. One more slide in terms of results, just to give a sense of how these break down by those tumour types. So I mentioned we focused on the four, and what we've also done is give a simpler treatment for all other cancers. So we do come up with estimates of the costs for all other cancers, but they're a little bit less nuanced with fewer specific assumptions. And this table here on the left shows both the number of cases in each of those categories, but also I mentioned right at the start here what we mean by preventable cancer is attributable to a modifiable risk factor, and the third column here describes what those risk factors are. And so, taking the first row, looking at lung cancer, maybe not surprising that almost 3/4 of those cases are attributable to tobacco, and then a further 13% or so are workplace-related, occupation-related risk factors. So taking all of those together, I mentioned the proportion of cancer cases that of preventable cancer cases that are attributed to those four tumour types is a little over half. That's then reflected in those costs that we've estimated. The right-hand side of this chart breaks those costs down between those different tumour types, and you see that's reflected in little over half of all of those costs being accounted for by lung, bowel, melanoma, and breast, with over a third actually of the total costs we've estimated accounted for by lung cancer alone. So those are all the results I wanted to present for now. There are more detailed numbers in the report, as I mentioned, that people can go and look up. But those were the headlines. But even if some of those numbers feel quite big, you might be thinking, so what? Why is this helpful or useful? What are the implications of this sort of analysis for health policy? And I think my view is that this sort of analysis, which, as I said at the start, is a cost of illness study, a cost of illness approach, can be helpful as part of a policy debate. And I think this is about where we choose to spend our taxpayer pounds, what areas of healthcare we choose to prioritise or deprioritise, tough decisions that fortunately I don't have to make, but those that do have to make those decisions, I think, want to draw on the best available evidence to help them do so. And in particular, I think what can be very valuable is combining this sort of cost of illness study, which gives you a sense of the size of the burden, or more positively, the size of the prize of costs that could be avoided if you're successful in preventing disease. If you combine that with what I would call an intervention study, which is a different sort of piece of work that says, well, what are the policy levers we could pull and how effective are they? So if I want to prevent lung cancer, what are the options I have for reducing the amount of smoking in the population? How much would it cost to pull that particular lever? What would it then create in terms of an impact? How many people would stop smoking as a result of intervention A? And is that more or less than if I funded intervention B instead? Putting those together with an understanding of the costs that are associated with those, the harms that come from those diseases, I think allows you then to develop your policy interventions on the basis of evidence. So in particular, that could be in doing appraisal. So that would be that could be a classic cost-benefit analysis of how much would it cost me to implement intervention X say, a smoking cessation service in a particular ICB area? How much is that going to cost me, and what are the benefits likely to be? Or it could be more about prioritization, some of those big challenges that I mentioned, where you're thinking, well, do I spend on a smoking cessation service, or do I invest in a public health campaign? Those might have different costs, or maybe they cost the same. Which one's going to have a bigger impact? Or to achieve a certain level of impact, what's the cheapest way of doing it? What's the cheapest lever I can pull to achieve a certain level of outcome? That would be a cost effectiveness analysis as an approach. I think this sort of evidence can also help with targeting, and I think that relates to health inequalities. I think if you're looking at particular areas, groups of the population that are disproportionately affected by preventable cancer, say, but equally other conditions as well, and that might be regional, it might be age-related, it might be related to ethnicity, but understanding how those costs vary with a sort of rich analysis of an understanding of those harms, combined with an understanding of what levers you can pull and how effective they might be, I think is the basis of good policy making. All of which to say, I feel like the sort of analysis I've presented here is just one example of sort of one bit of the jigsaw that can be helpful to policymakers. So with that, I think I've probably talked enough, and really interested to hear comments, questions from Lisa or from the floor. So I'll stop sharing and hand back to Lisa at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So yes, please do turn on your cameras, raise your hands if you'd like to ask Nick questions. All right, Nick, I'll start with the most difficult one.
Okay.
And you might not have the answer because you're an economist. So, but if anyone from the audience wants to contribute to the discussion or making their points, that would be very helpful. So, cancer is very dynamic and very, very diverse. So, what we start seeing, because, for example, there was a question in the chat from David about the assumption of 40%, that the fact that 40% of cancers are preventable. And this is a slice at some point in time based on many, many assumptions, basically. But cancer is evolving. So something that some cancers that were prevalent some decades ago are decreasing, and other cancers are increasing. The age is shifting. So now we have younger people being diagnosed with cancer. Maybe there is a biological shift based on external factors. Maybe we're diagnosing better, but definitely more cases there. And then lung cancer, we have more and more cases in non-smokers. And getting rid of pollution overnight is also a complicated thing. Plus, considering pollution, let's say in places like Delhi or Beijing, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but lung cancer must be the disease number one there if the pollution such a cause. So maybe there are external factors. So how can the model take into consideration this dynamic? Because it's all very well to assume that we can eliminate it, but human bodies are so complex that people who, let's say, avoided a particular cancer, no one guarantees they don't end up with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, to actually place the same burden, if not even more, on healthcare system. So my question is about dynamics, how all of this can be considered.
Yeah, great, really good question. Thank you. And I almost mentioned it during the presentation, actually, that is one limitation of where we had to narrow the scope of our ambition in terms of what we did in this analysis. So we did assume that 40%, for example, remained the same over 2023 to 2040, and that may not be accurate for precisely the reasons that you outlined, Lisa. Now, it absolutely is possible to include that in the analysis, and if anyone on the call happens to have any funding that they might want to spend on doing a richer bit of analysis, I would love to do that bit of analysis. Happy for that blatant plug there. I think it would be really interesting to understand the impact of some of those dynamics, as you say, rising rates of obesity, but declining rates of smoking, and so on and so forth. And I think there are other ways in which those dynamics make the picture more complicated. So another potential area for exploring is those survival rates, for example, that were built into our model. Over time, we would expect and hope that those would improve. So with new treatments, new technologies, what we have seen in recent decades is that those survival rates have been driven up and up, and we would hope that that trend would continue. And again, that was not built into our modeling at this stage, but that is the kind of thing you could explore to understand for those cases in 2024, 25, 26, 27, actually maybe you tweak some of those assumptions. So absolutely you can. The answer is, of course, more health economic modeling. But the other element, I think, which touches on the sort of policy side, which maybe I'll flag, is that lag. So the cancer cases that we observe in 2023 are the product of people who were smoking, for argument's sake, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And there are dynamics there in terms of the lag of any policy lever that you might pull, for example, how long it takes for that to feed through. So I think with technology, with that sort of cohort analysis of sort of generational change, I think there's lots of ways in which, as you suggest, those dynamics are much richer than we've really been able to explore in depth here.
Thank you, Nick. Francois, please.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Nick. It's a great presentation, great study. I wanted to challenge a little bit your conclusion around the decision making, the policy making, for the simple reason that you started with some conditions, so cancers, and you studied, let's say, for the sake of argument, the 3 key factors which are preventable, which are linked, associated with the occurrence of cancer. But I suppose that it may skew your policy decision because, let's say, it could be true that smoking is a main driver of the cost for cancers, but across all preventable disease, it could be obesity. So my question is whether it may be more appropriate to look at a preventable risk factor, say obesity, alcohol intake, which I think is a massive preventable risk factor of cancers or cardiovascular disease and so on try to assess what are the leading cause of preventable morbidity on the population to inform your decision policies.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Francois. Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. I think this analysis is one piece of that jigsaw. As I mentioned at the start, we've done work over the last couple of years looking at the costs of obesity, looking at the costs of cardiovascular disease, and they are equally alarming in terms of the scale of those numbers. And I think it's maybe even more complicated. It's always more complicated, as well as looking at those different conditions. Obviously, we know that many individuals, all of us individuals, we will have multiple different conditions, and we're smokers or not, and we're healthy weight or we're not, and so forth, and therefore those different conditions are related to each other, and pulling one lever, thinking about the impact it might have on cancer, well, it also will have an impact on lots of different things. And so absolutely, I certainly don't envy the
Well,
job of those decision makers who are trying to weigh up quite a complex problem with lots of different policy levers and lots of different potential outcomes.
All right, thank you, Nick. And we have a question from Nick for you. Nick, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Nick, for hosting today's talk. So I have a question sort of related to health guidelines in the UK. So I'm a final year medical student, and a big thing that we're taught throughout our training is sort of gold standard and first line investigations and management for a variety of different conditions. And a lot of those standards are based off of NICE guidelines. Now, I always assumed that those decisions were made for a combination of sort of the health benefits, the kind of ease of use of those investigations and management, but then cost must play a factor into it too. So my question is, when it comes to something like cancer, where some of the most novel treatment options can be very, very expensive, to what extent does the cost of a treatment affect whether or not that treatment or that investigation will be first line, gold standard, or something that's a little bit lower on that priority list? Not because it doesn't work or it doesn't work better than other potential treatments and therapies, but just because it's so expensive that something like the NHS wouldn't be able to afford it for everybody.
Yeah, really good question. And in a sense, it's a choice. So my view is that it is reasonable, but this is controversial. That some people would not like this. That it's reasonable to use a cost per QALY metric to understand if it's going to cost me £10,000 to achieve one QALY gain from intervention X, and it's going to cost me £100,000 from intervention Y, which might be some novel drug, for example, that our collective taxpayer pounds are better spent on achieving the QALY over here with that first intervention. Now, it's never quite as simple as that, obviously, and so the reason, for example, that the Cancer Drugs Fund was set up was precisely to invest in some of those sorts of high cost drugs which otherwise might be deprioritized, and to take the funding for those out of a separate pot. And I think there's an argument for doing that, where particularly if it's something novel. I think if you're thinking about innovation, I think there can be an argument for sort of testing it in that space on the basis that the cost then could come down. So either through scale or through learning, where it's a treatment rather than a drug, potentially, where rolling that treatment out, actually you work out how to do it at lower cost, such that it becomes mainstream rather than that in that sort of high cost bucket. But fundamentally, there is no escaping. There are those choices to make. As an economist, my starting point for that is, what's the gain? Can I quantify it in pounds terms or numerical terms, and then weighing up those options side by side. But I appreciate there are other considerations that are sort of out with my scope, and I'm happy to leave to other people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So next question is from Ala.
Hi, thanks. Quick question. If it hasn't been done already, or if you're not doing it already, what about the Labour government's tobacco and vapes bill, which will stop anybody born after January 2009 from purchasing tobacco? So that's a clear element. Then there are other elements which are to regulate vaping and to extend indoor smoking bans to outdoor spaces. But has government done a similar exercise to the one you're talking about, focused on lung cancer? Never mind the cardiac effects.
Yes. So the short answer is that the way policy making works is that those sorts of proposals would then have an impact assessment done.
Have you seen it? I know, but have you seen it?
I have not. No.
You haven't tried doing one yourself?
No. So those are usually So those would be done in-house typically
Yes, I know.
within the Department of Health, but they would be deploying the same, if not very similar, approaches to try and understand those harms. So that range of harms that I described in terms of quality of life, losses in terms of lost economic output, those would be the same categories that would go into that impact assessment.
Yeah, but they wouldn't include unpaid work and volunteering. So some of the elements that you've included would not be included. And tax loss would factor in as well to the model. So I just wonder whether anybody's seen it.
Yeah, well, I mean, interested to sort of throw that question more widely, and other people might chip in. I think it does raise an interesting, more general point, I think, about the perspective that you take on these different sorts of costs and benefits. So one version of that, if you like, is looking at financial versus non-financial benefits. And particularly, a lot of work we do in and around the NHS, there is understandably and quite rightly a pressure, if you're the financial director of a trust, that your particular perspective is, if I invest in this preventative intervention, is that what effect is that going to have on my organization? Is it going to stop people turning up at A&E?
It's national policy that I'm interested in.
Okay.
And your final slide, really, which was talking about interventions, but talking about policy interventions, and whether if you hone down preventive cancer, as I said, regardless of cardiac, because you could build in the cardiac effects as well. I'm just interested whether government actually did anything other than a back of the envelope calculation and thinking it's a good thing.
Well, I will not try and defend or attack or pass judgment.
Yeah, this is a confidential meeting.
All right, Nick, thank you very much for this answer. And John, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Nick. It was a great talk. It was a non-commissioned piece of work, and I wondered what the reaction has been to it and how you actually disseminate it from the company so that it has an impact. I mean, it's nice to see it on the web, but what has been the impact of this study, if any?
Thank you. Well, so we were really pleased and maybe a little surprised, actually. I think it got quite a lot of interest, which we were delighted by. So we initially did the work. It was at the end of 2023, which is why the 2023 basis for the numbers. And it did get onto the front page of a couple of newspapers a couple of times. Which was nice to see in terms of getting picked up and getting coverage. We're a private consulting firm. We're not a research organization. And although it was unfunded, obviously our motivation in part behind doing this bit of work is we'd like to find more people who'd like to pay us to do this type of work as well. And so it's a bit of an exemplar of the sort of analysis that can be done. And certainly over the last 18 months and before we did this work as well, we have seen more organizations, both in the public sector and also private sector, being interested in doing this sort of work and understanding the burden of disease. So I certainly wouldn't put that more general trend down to us by any means, but we were pleased with the reaction and the interest that we've had, and are pleased to be doing more work in this space.
Right, thanks.
So just to finish up on John's question, do you hope to do the work, or you actually are doing it, or you're hoping to get funding to do the work in this space?
Well, so we've done other. I mean, if you go to Frontier's website, would recommend anyone do it. Lots of good stuff on there. We've done work, for example, I mentioned on obesity, which is on our website. That was that sort of funded pieces of work. We've done work on cardiovascular disease, which are upcoming. We did a piece on respiratory conditions, which was published in the European Respiratory Journal, ERJ Open, which I could point people to. So we are continuing to do work, and I hope for years to come as well, there'll be more opportunities to do it.
An interesting study could be on obesity with the new drugs, because they obviously going to cost absolute fortune to improve health and possibly prevent cancer, as you suggest, and maybe balancing it off what comes out in the first place. So it's definitely some prevention mechanisms are not as cheap as we can imagine.
Yeah, and it's absolutely a hugely interesting space, particularly with the launch of those obesity drugs. There's been a particular attention there. The National Food Strategy going back a year or two, and I think that I'm expecting more interest in this space, not least because if you go back to that slide of the context and the pressures, these problems are worsening rather than improving in a lot of areas. So it will become more and more important, I think, to think about the solutions.
All right, Nick, thank you so much for a very insightful talk, very interesting information. So we'll see everyone in 2 weeks, and have a good evening.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you all for joining.